Grace Barrett signed her name before dawn and felt the paper drag beneath the nib, as if the contract itself resisted her, then surrendered, then held her there. By breakfast, her trunk had been sent ahead. Her old keyring had been removed from her reticule by her mother's maid, and she was seated in the east carriage with Mrs. Lenora Barrett opposite her, gloved hands folded over a ledger that did not leave her lap for the entire drive to Renford House. The house received them with polished silence. Beeswax, starch, old stone, and a faint trace of lavender from the entry rugs rose together in the throat and stayed there. Footmen moved with rehearsed precision. No one addressed Grace directly until Lenora nodded once, as if granting temporary use of property. "Miss Barrett's room is the blue chamber," Lenora said to the butler. "Her gowns are to be inventoried by noon. Personal correspondence is to pass through my desk." She did not raise her voice. She never needed to. Grace followed the maid upstairs, one hand on the banister worn smooth by 2 centuries of titled palms. And she understood with a clarity that left no room for panic that she had crossed from one form of dependence into another, far narrower one. Renford House belonged to old money and older habits. Even the carpets seemed to expect compliance. Her room was handsome in the manner of inherited things. Pale wallpaper printed with climbing vines, a coal grate with carved marble trim, a writing table set at the window where rain had etched thin lines down the glass. The desk had no key. Her own dispatch box, delivered behind her, had been tied shut with fresh cord and sealed in wax, bearing her mother's signet. She did not call out. She set her gloves on the table in an exact pair and asked the maid, "Would you bring me hot water, please, Elsie?" The girl, startled at the use of her name, then looked quickly toward the corridor, as if someone might have heard. "Yes, miss," she whispered. After she left, Grace touched the wax seal with her thumb. It had not yet hardened. By the second morning, the routines had narrowed. Lenora took breakfast in the morning room and issued instructions between sips of tea as if discussing weather, never looking long at Grace, always looking at paper. "The Ashwick invitation list is incomplete. You will wear the cream silk this evening. You speak too freely with staff." Each sentence arrived flat and finished, with no room in it for answer. Grace learned that refusal was not argued against in this house. It was entered as an administrative delay and quietly routed around. "Mr. Ashwick's mother has requested your measurements," Lenora said on the third day, turning a page. "Mrs. Pike will attend at 11. Grace buttered her toast and set the knife down before speaking. "I have not accepted Mr. Ashwick." Lenora lifted her eyes then, grey and untroubled, eyes that had once softened only for figures in a bank book and for no one else. "You signed the family agreement. The acceptance is implicit. A marriage is not an annex. A marriage is a settlement." Lenora returned to her ledger, and settlements preserve families from collapse. The words were clean, almost elegant. That made them worse. At 11, Mrs. Pike arrived with tape and pins and a face trained into professional blankness. Grace stood on the fitting block while lengths of imported lace were lifted against her shoulders and rejected for being too costly for current circumstances, though Lenora's emerald bracelets flashed in the same light. "The veil from Lausanne?" Mrs. Pike asked. Lenora said no without consulting Grace. She has no need of such embellishment. Grace watched her own reflection in the long mirror. Dark hair smoothed into obedience. Collarbones held still, mouth composed. Useful, she thought, if not remarkable. In the afternoon, Lenora summoned her to the study for signatures on household correspondence. The study smelled of sealing wax, ink, and leather that had known too many transactions. A locked writing desk stood beneath the window, brass corners polished, key absent. Grace recognized it at once. It had been her father's, and after his death it had held trust papers he once told her, in a rare unguarded hour, were to remain hers by right, no matter what debts came or went. Now, Lenora kept the desk closed and the key hidden, speaking across it as if it were merely furniture. "You will copy these invitations in your hand," Lenora said. "Lady Markham notices such details, and she must not suspect strain. Mention the musicale. Omit the reduced guest list language." Grace took the packet. Reduced because of the arrears? Lenora's expression did not alter. Reduced because excess is vulgar. Grace sat at the side table and wrote while Lenora reviewed columns. Names flowed beneath her pen. Baronets, widows, cousins who had not visited in years but would come if they scented negotiation. Her hand remained steady through 3 pages. On the 4th, she paused at Mr. and Mrs. Ashwick of Redwell Park and blotted a drop of ink into the margin. Lenora's gaze shifted there, then back to the accounts. "You may begin again," she said. "Carelessness reads as dissent." Late that evening, after the lamps were lowered, Grace carried her own glass pitcher down the back corridor because the footman had been dismissed for the night, and because thirst did not consult rank. The kitchen range still radiated heat. Copper pans glowed in dull rows. She filled the pitcher at the scullery pump, the handle cold in her palm, and as she turned she saw Elsie bent over a basket of mending, trying to hide torn cuffs in a seam too small to hold. "Give me that," Grace said quietly, setting down the pitcher. She threaded a needle and showed the girl a stronger stitch her nurse had once taught her for riding gloves. The moment lasted less than a minute. It cost nothing, and something both. Elsie thanked her without meeting her eyes. When Grace returned upstairs, Lenora was waiting in the upper hall, in a robe of dark satin, one candle held at chest height. "You are not to enter service corridors unaccompanied," she said. "I needed water. You ring." The bell-pull did not answer. "Then you wait." Lenora's gaze dropped to Grace's hands, then to the thread still caught at her cuff. "Familiarity erodes order, Grace. You are not a child in a merchant household any longer." The correction landed where it was meant to land: class, origin, and debt, bound in one phrase. Grace inclined her head. "As you wish." She slept little. The mattress was soft, the pillow scented with lavender, and the room felt like a velvet box with the lid nearly shut. Twice she woke thinking she had heard her father in the corridor, not his voice but the measured pace of his shoes, and each time she remembered where she was and lay still until dawn. 3 days passed in the same careful rhythm. Breakfast directives, copied notes, fittings, supervised walks on the gravel path beyond the orangery, with a companion half a step behind. The path curved past yew hedges clipped into strict geometry, then back toward the house without ever reaching the outer gate. Grace timed the circuit unconsciously by the chapel bell from the village beyond the trees. 7 minutes out, 7 back. She began to count the stones in the border to keep from counting losses. On the 4th afternoon, Lenora received a solicitor in the study. Grace was told to bring tea and leave at once. The tray was heavy with silver and thin porcelain that chimed faintly at each step. She reached the door and paused only because the butler had not yet opened it, and in that short pause she heard her mother's voice through oak panels and brass lockwork, cool and bored, discussing her daughter as if discussing timber futures. "She will marry where I instruct," Lenora said. "Affection does not settle accounts." A man's voice answered, lower, cautious. "Miss Barrett may object if the trust terms are examined." "She will not examine what she cannot access." The tray bit into Grace's palms. Heat from the pot seeped through linen and into her skin. She shifted the weight once and held it steady. Her breath flattened in her chest and refused to deepen. "Do not spill, do not drop. Do not grant them even this." The butler opened the door. Grace entered with perfect composure, set the tea service before them, and did not let her gaze rest on either face for more than courtesy required. Lenora glanced up only long enough to note that the cups were aligned. "Leave the documents," Lenora told the solicitor, as though Grace were absent. "I will see them executed by morning." Grace inclined her head once and withdrew. In the corridor, she kept walking until the study door was 2 turns behind her, and the house quieted again into wax and stone and order. At the window overlooking the south lawn, she stopped and placed both hands on the sill to steady the tremor that had reached her fingers at last. She did not cry. She stood there until the shaking passed, then straightened the cuff she had mended for another woman, and went downstairs to copy the invitations for a wedding she had not chosen. The ink had not yet dried on the last Ashwick envelope when the house clock struck 9, and Grace kept writing because stillness invited thought, and thought invited rage she could not spend. The nib scratched, paused, scratched again. Wax cooled in red pools beside her hand. Through the open transom she could hear the corridor maid beat dust from a runner with short, apologetic blows, each strike followed by silence, as though even noise required permission at Renford House. At 9:30, Mrs. Cray from the linen room appeared at the threshold with a narrow ledger and an expression that asked pardon before it spoke. "Mrs. Barrett requires signatures, miss. One for the lace inventory, one for your winter cloaks, and one for the removal of duplicate gloves." "Duplicate?" Grace asked. Mrs. Cray shifted her weight. 3 pairs were deemed excessive. Grace set her pen down and signed where directed. Her name travelled across 3 pages, elegant and binding in ways no one had explained when she was young enough to trust signatures as proof of personhood rather than transfer of control. Mrs. Cray thanked her and gathered the sheets. At the door, she stopped. "Cook has held back a slice of seed cake, miss, if you would like it sent up." Grace thought of the scullery heat and Elsie's bent shoulders over mending. "Send it to the kitchen, for whoever is still on duty." Mrs. Cray's mouth flickered, not quite a smile. "Yes, miss." Sleep came in short pieces. Before dawn had fully lifted, the maid lit her fire and laid out the cream morning gown Lenora had selected. Grace dressed without ringing for assistance, fingers moving through hooks and ribbon by memory, while the pale light widened over the lawn. Her own reflection looked composed and unconsulted. In the mirror, the room behind her appeared grand enough to flatter captivity. Breakfast in the morning room ran on schedule and on command. Lenora sat at the head of the small table with her ledger open beside a silver coffee pot, grey eyes moving from columns to correspondence while she spoke. "You will write to Lady Markham and confirm Friday. The Ashwick steward requests your preferred chapel hymn. Choose one with fewer musicians. There is no need to perform abundance." She reached for marmalade. "And do not address staff by Christian names." Grace folded her napkin once before answering. "Names are not impropriety. Familiarity confuses hierarchy. Hierarchy has never reduced hunger." Lenora did not look up. "You are not asked for commentary." The window panes held a pale sky, and beyond them she could see the clipped yews that bordered the gravel walk she had paced like a caged thought for 4 days. She took tea, no sugar, and swallowed before the heat settled in her throat. The butler entered with the morning post on a tray, and Lenora sorted it in practiced motions, bills to her left, invitations to her right, anything addressed in Grace's hand placed beneath the ledger, until it vanished. After breakfast, Mrs. Pike returned for alterations, bringing folded muslin and thin steel pins that flashed like small threats between her fingers. Grace stood on the fitting block, while seams were opened and narrowed to suit an arrangement everyone discussed as arithmetic. "The waistline must be more modest," Lenora said from the settee. "Ashwick's aunt dislikes display." Mrs. Pike pinned the bodice and murmured, "If Miss Barrett breathes deeply, the seam will pull." "Then Miss Barrett will breathe discreetly," Lenora answered. Grace met her own eyes in the mirror and kept her shoulders level. A pin caught at her sleeve. She did not flinch. At the end, Mrs. Pike presented a veil trimmed with imported lace, clearly costly, clearly chosen to signal rank. Lenora examined the invoice and pushed it back. "Charge this to my personal account, not household wages." Grace turned from the mirror. "No, return it." Lenora's gaze sharpened. "The decision is not yours." Grace lifted the veil herself, felt the softness of it against her wrist, and placed it back into Mrs. Pike's box. "Then enter it, as my refusal." Mrs. Pike froze between them, pins caught in her cuff. Lenora held Grace's face in a long, unblinking look that contained no heat at all. "Useful," she said at last, and reached for her coffee. "If not remarkable." The words landed in the room like cut stone. Grace inclined her head once. "As you wish." By the following Thursday, the house had taught her the cadence of its control so thoroughly she could predict which footstep meant instruction and which meant surveillance. At 10, she copied letters in the study under Lenora's eye, the locked writing desk always in view beneath the window, brass corners bright with handling. At noon, she walked the south path with Mrs. Fell, a companion selected for obedience rather than conversation, who carried a parasol and reported deviations in tone as if they were weather readings. At 2, she reviewed guest seating for people who had known her since childhood, and now discussed her as though she were a parcel crossing county lines. That afternoon, on the path near the orangery, Grace slowed beside the herb border where thyme spread in low silver-green mats, and bees moved from blossom to blossom with more freedom than she possessed. A kitchen maid hurried past carrying a crate of turnips too wide for her arms. One slid, fell, and split in the gravel. Mrs. Fell clicked her tongue. "Clumsy girl." Grace stepped off the path, lifted the crate from the maid's shaking grip, and set it on the low wall. "Take 2 journeys," she said quietly. "Not one." The maid stared, then curtsied, breathless. "Thank you, miss." Mrs. Fell's parasol snapped open, though there was no sun to warrant it. "You must not perform labour in view of tenants." "I lifted wood and water for years," Grace said. "You are at Renford now." Grace returned to the path. "Exactly." When she reached her room, Lenora was waiting by the mantel, one gloved hand resting on the marble as if claiming even the stone. "Mrs. Fell tells me you interfered with kitchen duties." "I prevented a spill." "You diminished your standing." "By touching turnips." "By forgetting your place." Grace crossed to the writing table and arranged 3 unopened notes in a straight line before speaking. "My place is where I stand." Lenora's expression did not alter. "Your place is where you are put." She left without slamming the door because Lenora never needed noise to win a point. Grace remained motionless until the latch settled. Then she untied the first note and found another guest list, corrected in Lenora's hand. That evening, footmen were dismissed early to reduce lamp expense in the upper corridor, and the bell pull in Grace's room drew no response when she tested it. Thirst pressed at the back of her throat. She took up her empty glass pitcher and went down the rear stair where heat from the kitchens climbed in heavy waves, and the stone steps held the day's damp. In the scullery, water struck the basin with a clear metallic rhythm that sounded almost defiant in the quiet house. She turned with the filled pitcher and nearly collided with 2 stable boys carrying sackcloth, both trying not to be seen, both too young to hide exhaustion. Grace stepped aside first and held the door for them. One murmured thanks without looking up. The other glanced at her in alarm, then at her dress, then away. In the passage beyond the kitchens, a side door stood ajar to the service yard, and through it she could see the last of the light, flattening over packed earth, cart ruts and a row of neglected planters beside the wall. A man knelt near the planters with his sleeves rolled and his gloves dark with mud, working at a bent iron frame that supported the espalier pears. He moved with economical precision, not hurried, not idle, and though his coat was plain and weathered, nothing about him suggested disorder. His shoulders were set square. His boots, even stained, had been well made. He did not glance up when a groom crossed behind him. The groom changed direction anyway. Mrs. Fell's warning from earlier in the day was still in Grace's ear, thin as wire. She took the picture to the threshold, hesitated only long enough to register the impropriety expected of her, and stepped into the yard. The man heard her then and rose, removing one glove with deliberate care before turning. His eyes were grey, but not Lenora's cold, ledger grey. These were alert, assessing, and unexpectedly tired, as if sleep had become a negotiable indulgence. A shallow line crossed one brow, old and pale. He was older than she had first assumed from the distance, perhaps mid-30s, with a face weathered by work and restraint in equal measure. "You have been at this since morning," Grace said, holding out the picture. "Take this before it chills." He looked at the glass, then at her hand, then at her face as though confirming she understood what she was doing. "Miss Barrett," he said, and his voice carried the measured consonants of a man educated above his coat. "You ought not to be in the service yard unaccompanied." "I am accompanied by my own poor judgment," she said, surprising herself. Something like amusement touched his mouth and vanished. He accepted the pitcher with his bare hand and drank, not greedily, not politely either. Only as a thirsty man drinks when he has been taught to hide need and cannot, for one moment, be bothered. When he lowered the glass, a trace of water remained at his lower lip. He wiped it with the back of his wrist and returned the pitcher with care not to brush her fingers. "Thank you," he said. "You notice thirst before rank, Miss Barrett." The sentence settled between them with the exactness of a signature. Not flirtation, recognition. Grace held the pitcher against her skirt and felt the cool glass through fabric. "And you notice rank while pretending not to care for it." He tilted his head, considering her as if she had offered a problem worth solving. "My name is Hale. I oversee the lower gardens." "Oversee?" "Dig when needed, count when required, repair what has been neglected." Behind him, the bent iron frame now stood true, secured with twine, and a new bolt she had not seen him fetch. He glanced toward the house, toward upper windows where no curtain moved yet, where observation always existed, then back to her. "You should go inside before Mrs. Fell discovers your rebellion." "It was not rebellion," Grace said. "No, it was water." He held her gaze for a moment longer, and in that stillness she felt the first true crack in the architecture Lenora had built around her, small and precise and real. He stepped back, reclaiming his glove, the distance restored with courtesy that looked practiced and costly. "Good evening, Miss Barrett." "Good evening, Mr. Hale." She returned through the side door carrying an empty pitcher, and for the first time since arriving at Renford House, the corridors smelled of beeswax and stone, and something else she could not yet name, something steadier than fear. Grace set the empty pitcher on the washstand in her room and stood with both hands braced on porcelain until the pulse in her wrists settled, the cool rim pressing crescents into her skin. The house had gone quiet in that particular Renford manner that suggested not rest, but surveillance at a distance, as if walls themselves were listening for deviation. When Elsie came to bank the fire, she glanced at the pitcher and then quickly at Grace's face. "Shall I ring for fresh water, miss?" "No, thank you." Elsie hesitated. "Mrs. Fell has asked whether you returned directly from the scullery." Grace folded her shawl once, neatly. "You may tell Mrs. Fell that I returned with what I needed." The maid nodded and withdrew, leaving behind a trace of soap and starch in the warmed air. Grace unpinned her hair without calling for assistance and watched dark strands fall loose over her shoulders in the mirror. She ought to have felt only caution. Instead, she felt a thin, steady line of relief she could not justify. A man in mud-streaked sleeves had spoken to her as if her judgment belonged to her. Not praise, not flirtation, recognition. It was a small thing and therefore dangerous. At breakfast the next morning, Lenora read from correspondence while untouched eggs cooled on her plate. Lady Markham confirms attendance. Ashwick's chaplain requires your chosen reading by Thursday. Mrs. Pike will return with revised cuffs. You will remain within the south grounds this afternoon. Grace spread marmalade on toast with precise economy. Am I now to be issued a map of permitted gravel? Lenora did not look up. You are to be issued clarity. The butler entered with 2 account books and placed them by Lenora's elbow. Grace noticed not for the first time that anything written in her hand was sorted beneath her mother's files before it was sent. She said nothing. Silence had become a currency she spent carefully. By late afternoon she had endured measurements, guest list amendments, and another rehearsal of gratitude she was expected to perform when Ashwick's aunt visited. Her head ached with perfume and propriety. She took a book from the blue chamber shelf and went down to the conservatory, the one room in Renford where glass and green life softened the edges of command. The lock had resisted her every evening since arrival. She had learned to set her shoulder against the door and lift the handle at a narrow angle that scraped her palm. Today, the latch gave, at once. She stopped with the door half open, fingers still on brass. The mechanism had been repaired cleanly. New screws, aligned plate. No splintered frame. She stepped inside. Damp earth and citrus leaves met her like a different country. A clay pot had been moved from the threshold so it would not catch her hem. On the narrow iron table by the west window lay a folded scrap of coarse paper weighted with a pruning knife. She unfolded it. The hinge seized from the inside. It should not. No name, no signature. The handwriting was spare and disciplined, each letter upright as if trained. She heard footfall on gravel beyond the glass and looked up. Hale was outside along the espalier wall, examining the ties on an apricot branch with gloved hands. He did not turn, though he must have known she was there. Grace crossed to the side door and stepped out beneath the stone arch where wisteria had not yet taken bloom. "You entered a locked room," she said. "I entered a neglected one. You might have asked." He tightened a knot, tested it, and only then faced her. Would permission have been granted? No. Then asking would have been theatre. The answer should have offended. Instead, it drew a reluctant curve at the corner of her mouth. "You have repaired my theatre door." "A room should open from the inside, Miss Barrett." The line landed with practical weight and an undertone she could not safely name. His eyes were grey and sharply attentive, but not invasive. He looked as if he observed weather patterns, soil conditions, load-bearing beams, and people with the same unsparing clarity. She realized he had noticed the red mark at the base of her thumb where the old latch had pinched skin each evening. "Thank you," she said, the words formal enough to hide the steadier pulse beneath them. He inclined his head once. "The thanks belongs to the hinges." A stable hand came through the gate carrying twine and stopped when he saw Hale. No spoken order followed. Hale merely shifted his gaze toward the cold frame by the north wall. The stable hand nodded immediately, turned and changed direction. Grace watched him go, then looked back at Hale. "You oversee lower gardens," she said lightly, "and whatever else in this house has been left to rust." There was humour there, dry and brief, gone before it could be examined. He turned back to the espalier ties, signalling the exchange complete. Grace returned to the conservatory with her book unopened in her hands and sat by the window where the repaired latch gleamed in late light. She read the same page 3 times without retaining a line. 3 days later, by the second week of October, the repaired door had become the one boundary in Renford House that answered to her touch instead of someone else's key. Grace took her hour there each afternoon while Mrs. Fell believed she was copying readings for the chapel ceremony. On Thursday, she carried a tray of tea to the south terrace because Lenora was receiving 2 parish ladies and preferred service outdoors when discussing charitable economies. Wind moved the tablecloth corners. Rose canes clicked softly against their stakes. The steward, Mr. Dunley, was arguing with a delivery man near the lower path, voices sharp enough to carry. "We cannot accept 12 crates when 6 were ordered. Invoice says 12. Invoice says what you wrote after the fact." The parish ladies paused, eager for spectacle without admitting it. Lenora continued stirring tea as though men disputing beside her roses were a seasonal nuisance. Grace set cups and saucers in a straight line and saw Hale crossing from the kitchen garden with a wheelbarrow of turned soil. Dunley called to him with irritation. "Hale, tell this man what was requested." Hale set down the barrow and took the invoice from Dunley's hand. He scanned it once. 6 crates of lime wash, 2 of nails, 4 of cedar pegs. Total 12. You charge transport at summer rate. It is now Michaelmas tariff. He handed the paper back to the delivery man. "Revise and return tomorrow." The delivery man drew breath to protest, then met Hale's eyes and shut his mouth. "Yes, tomorrow." He led his horse out without another word. Dunley stared after him, annoyed at being corrected, more annoyed at accepting the correction. "You might have said that sooner. You might have read the lower line." Dunley coloured and bent to gather the misplaced papers. Hale lifted the wheelbarrow handles again and moved on. Grace poured Lenora's tea. "Mr. Hale keeps excellent accounts for a gardener." Lenora took the cup. "He was hired to reduce waste. Competence is not rank." One of the parish ladies, lips pursed over her saucer, murmured, "Useful men can be found in unusual coats." Grace set down the teapot before answering. "Useful women as well." Lenora's glance cut toward her and away, too quick for rebuke in company. The conversation returned to parish blankets and coal allotments, but Grace's attention stayed on the lower path, where Hale had disappeared beyond clipped yews, leaving behind order where there had been argument. On Sunday she walked to St. Cuthbert's Chapel under Mrs. Fell's supervision, skirts lifted above damp leaves, prayer book tucked beneath her glove. The path from Renford crossed the village lane and past tenant cottages roofed in slate darkened by mist. Children chalked hop patterns on stone by the smithy and stopped to curtsy when Mrs. Fell's parasol appeared. Grace answered each greeting by name until Mrs. Fell hissed, "Miss Barrett, distance is proper." "Distance is convenient," Grace said. The chapel service ended in 40 minutes of dutiful piety and twice that length of social accounting on the steps. Lenora had remained at home, citing correspondence. Mrs. Fell was drawn into conversation with the rector's wife about lace donations, leaving Grace briefly unattended by design rather than mercy. She moved to the low wall where villagers waited to speak with estate representatives about rents, drains, and winter repairs. Dunley stood there with a notebook offering delays in polished phrases. Hale stood 2 paces behind him, carrying no notebook at all. A farmer in a patched coat removed his cap. "Sir, the Eastfield culvert has collapsed again. Water sits ankle deep. If we do not clear it this week, the roots will spoil." Dunley began. "Submit a request through the proper channel." Hale said, "How many labourers can you spare tomorrow?" The farmer blinked. "3, sir." "Renford sends 4 at first light. We open the culvert before noon." He looked to Dunley without turning his head. "Charge timber to drainage maintenance, line 6, not tenant arrears." Dunley's jaw tightened. "That line is already constrained." "Then remove the ballroom lantern allocation. The ceiling can endure 2 fewer chandeliers." The farmer stared between them, uncertain whom to thank. Hale nodded once, dismissal and assurance together. "Be there at dawn." When the man stepped away, Grace remained by the wall longer than courtesy required. Hale finally looked toward her. In public, his expression held neutral reserve, yet his attention sharpened for half a beat, as if taking stock. No gloves torn, no companion at elbow, no immediate risk. She recognized that brief inventory because she had begun to do the same with him. "You have reassigned chandeliers to culverts," she said. "Water outranks glass." "Not in most drawing rooms." "This is not most." He paused, then added, "You should return before Mrs. Fell discovers she has misplaced you." The phrasing echoed their first meeting so precisely, she nearly smiled. "She will conclude I was abducted by parish widows." A grim fate. There it was again, the dry edge that never quite became jest. Mrs. Fell called her name from the chapel gate, flustered. Grace inclined her head to Hale and turned back toward duty, but she carried his 2 words with her all afternoon. This is not most. 5 days passed in a chain of household obligations designed to keep her visible and unavailable. Lenora reviewed dowry correspondence with Ashwick's solicitor in the study, while Grace copied duplicate ledgers under supervision. Mrs. Pike fitted the wedding sleeves with cuffs too narrow for comfort, and called restraint elegant. The bell pull in Grace's room failed twice, and was repaired only after she submitted a written request in triplicate. She began rising earlier to claim 15 minutes in the conservatory before the household woke, and more than once she found small work already done there. A cracked plant pot replaced, mildew scrubbed from the sill. The warped shutter eased so morning light reached the reading chair. No notes accompanied these repairs. None were necessary. On the 6th morning, she entered the kitchen garden at dawn to collect rosemary for Cook, who had whispered that fresh sprigs made weak broth taste less like economy. Mist lay low over the beds. Hale was at the potting table, sorting seed packets into orderly stacks. Sleeves rolled, a narrow scar visible along his forearm where glove met skin. Beside him stood 2 boys from the stable yard, listening with solemn intensity as he demonstrated grafting cuts on a pear branch. "Not deep," he said. "Precise. If you cut for speed, you lose the tree." One boy nicked the bark too far. He flinched as if expecting rebuke. Hale only took the knife, trimmed the edge clean, and handed it back. Again. Grace waited until the boys ran off with their bundles, then set her basket on the table. "You teach like a schoolmaster." "I teach so we do not bury avoidable errors in spring." She selected 3 rosemary sprigs, inhaled resin and damp earth, and asked without looking up, "Who taught you?" "A man who believed discipline was a kindness." The answer came too quickly to be invented and too guarded to pursue. She changed course. "Cook says the West Orchard produced half its usual yield." because pruning was delayed 3 seasons and blight was called bad luck instead of bad management. He tapped a stack of seed packets. That will alter. You speak as though the estate belongs to your decisions. He met her gaze then, steady and unreadable. Stewardship belongs to whoever does the work. A bell rang from the rear corridor, summoning staff. He pulled on his gloves. Conversation closed. Grace lifted her basket. Thank you for the rosemary advice, Mr. Hale. I gave none. You gave context. It will do. He looked as if he might answer, then only inclined his head. She turned toward the kitchen door and felt, rather than saw, his attention follow until she crossed the threshold. That evening, Lenora hosted a modest supper for selected neighbours, who preferred gossip in private rooms to gossip in crowded halls. Grace was seated between a colonel's widow and Mr. Ashwick's cousin, both eager to appraise her pliancy through polite questions. She answered in complete sentences, offered no openings, and watched candlelight fracture across crystal while talk turned to estate efficiencies. Someone mentioned that Renford's tenant complaints had fallen sharply over the past fortnight. Dunley has become unexpectedly effective, Ashwick's cousin said. Lenora cut her pheasant with calm precision. Mr. Dunley follows instruction when properly supervised. Grace took water, eyes on her plate. Supervision appears to have many hands. Lenora's gaze rested on her, cool and measuring. Do not mistake visibility for influence. No, Grace said. I have learned the difference. After supper, as guests gathered in the drawing room for cards, Grace slipped out through the side corridor to the conservatory on the pretext of fetching the devotional she had left there. The repaired latch opened soundlessly. Moonlight silvered the leaves. On the iron table lay a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Winter bulbs, labelled in neat script, and beneath them a short list of planting depths and dates. At the bottom, one line only. South windows hold heat longest. No signature. No flourish. She touched the edge of the paper and felt the odd steadiness that had begun to grow in her since the service yard. Not hope, not yet, but the return of proportion. In a house that catalogued her as a transfer, someone had noticed where light lasted. She folded the note and placed it inside her prayer book, then carried the bulbs upstairs herself, cradled like contraband and promise together. She set the bulbs on the narrow sill above her washstand, where the moonlight found their paper skins and turned them the colour of old ivory, then slid the unsigned planting list beneath her prayer book and extinguished the lamp before anyone could knock and ask what she carried, as if explanation were a duty. At dawn she woke to a fine, dry scent of soil from the cloth bundle, dressed without ringing, and carried the bulbs back to the conservatory in her work basket beneath a folded shawl. The repaired latch yielded soundlessly. She knelt at the south windows, where the glass held night's last chill at the edges and a pocket of warmth at the centre, and pressed each bulb into dark loam by the measurements on Hale's note. 2 inches, 4 inches, space between each root, enough for growth, not enough for waste. By the time the first bell sounded from the servants' corridor, she had tamped the soil smooth and wiped her hands clean on the inside hem of her underskirt. When she turned to leave, she found Mrs. Cray at the door with the linen ledger held flat against her apron, as if it might shield her from conversation. "Miss Barrett, I did not know you were here." "Then we are both early," Grace said. "What has happened?" Mrs. Cray hesitated, eyes dropping to the turned pots, then lifting toward Grace's face with the careful neutrality of staff who had learned to survive on a mission. 2 men from Lower Gardens were dismissed last night. Mr. Dunley read the order after supper. Mr. Rigg and Mr. Lyle. Grace set down the trowel. For what cause? Reduction. Mrs. Cray swallowed. Mrs. Barrett marked them non-essential. Winter pruning is to be delayed. Non-essential. Grace felt the word as a familiar pressure at the base of her throat. She took up her basket. Were their wages settled? Half only. The steward says the rest may be entered if spring receipts improve. Half paid for full labour. Mrs. Cray gave the smallest nod. Yes, miss. At breakfast, Lenora spoke of chapel readings and silk invoices while sunlight struck the silver toast rack and made it glare. Grace waited until the butler withdrew. Mr. Rigg and Mr. Lyle were dismissed without full wages. Lenora spread marmalade to the edge of her slice with unhurried precision. I am aware. They worked through harvest. They worked in excess of necessity. Necessity to whom? Lenora lifted her eyes, grey, untroubled. To solvency. Renford is not a charity table, Grace. No, Grace said. It is an estate. Estates require winter labour. Estates require cash flow. Lenora reached for her coffee. You will not involve yourself in staffing decisions again. Grace held her gaze one measured beat, then lowered her own to the tea she did not drink. As you wish. By late morning she had copied 2 pages of invitations and 1 page of dowry correspondence in a hand, so even it might have belonged to someone untouched by consequence. When Mrs. Fell came to escort her on the south path, Grace took the route, without argument, counted the turn at the yew hedge, and stumbled deliberately at the corner where gravel gave to packed lane. Mrs. Fell drew in a breath. Miss Barrett, are you injured? My boot seam has split, Grace said, lifting her hem enough to show nothing at all. I cannot walk another yard without tearing it. Mrs. Fell looked toward the house, toward propriety, toward inconvenience. The cobbler is in the village. We are not expected there. Then no one will notice us. The companion made a face that conveyed both disapproval and surrender. 10 minutes. The village lane smelled of damp straw and coal smoke. Grace entered Penrith and Son, goldsmith and broker, where polished glass cases held rings and buckles under a film of old dust, and a brass bell announced her with more enthusiasm than the proprietor showed on his face. Mr. Penrith bowed, eyes flicking once to her cloak quality, then to Mrs. Fell waiting by the door. How may I assist, miss? Grace unfastened the small brooch hidden in the seam pocket of her reticule. Seed pearls in a narrow crescent around a pale citrine, worn smooth at the pin hinge by years of careful handling. Her father had given it to her on her 20th birthday in a plain paper box, saying only, "Keep one thing no one can audit." She laid it on black velvet between them. I require valuation and immediate purchase. Mr. Penrith lifted it with tweezers, turned it to the light, and made the soft professional sound of a man who saw sentiment and converted it to market. Fine workmanship. Minor wear. I can offer 32. It was appraised at 46. 3 years ago, perhaps. He set it down. 34, with coin now. Grace thought of 2 men leaving Renford through the rear gate with half wages in their pockets and winter ahead. 36, and a written receipt naming no household. Mr. Penrith's brows rose a fraction. 35 and the receipt as requested. Done. He counted sovereigns and smaller notes with brisk fingers and wrote a receipt in cramped ink. Grace folded it once and tucked it into her glove. She did not look at the empty velvet square when he carried the brooch to the back room. Outside, Mrs. Fell's mouth tightened. I am not obliged to report private purchases. This was a private loss, Grace said. At Renford, she went first to the kitchen on the pretext of checking broth herbs, then to the linen passage where Mrs. Cray reviewed mending allocations at a narrow desk. Grace set the folded notes beneath the ledger and laid 2 fingers over them so they would not be refused by instinct. Mr. Rigg and Mr. Lyle are to be paid in full and return to work tomorrow. Mrs. Cray stared at the money, then at Grace. Miss Barrett, I cannot authorize. Then you will place this against Lower Gardens arrears and enter it under anonymous maintenance donation. The steward will ask questions. Tell him the donation came with a condition. Mrs. Cray's eyes shifted toward the corridor, checking for witnesses. If Mrs. Barrett learns, she will learn when the hedges survive winter. Grace removed her hand. Count it. Mrs. Cray counted in quick, practiced motions, lips moving silently through sums. It covers arrears and 6 weeks at reduced rate. Then enter 6 weeks today. Grace drew out Mr. Penrith's receipt and placed it beneath the notes. If anyone challenges source, tell them it was mine to lose. Mrs. Cray inhaled once, sharply. Yes, miss. Grace left before gratitude could be spoken aloud and used as evidence. 2 days passed in the narrow machinery of Renford routine. Lenora reviewed invitation responses. Mrs. Pike adjusted sleeve cuffs and called Payne elegant. Mr. Dunley kept his distance but watched Grace from the edge of rooms, with the alert resentment of a man who suspected an alteration in accounts he could not trace cleanly. Hale did not approach her in the conservatory or on the path. Once, crossing the kitchen yard at dusk, she saw him speaking with Rigg and Lyle by the tool shed, all 3 heads bent over a work slate, their shoulders set in practical concentration. No one looked up. By the 3rd evening of October's 2nd week, she returned to her room after prayers and found a folded paper resting on the sill beside the last of the bulbs she had not yet planted. No seal, no name. She opened it by candlelight. Lower Gardens payroll entered through November. Rigg reinstated to Orchard Wall. Lyle reinstated to Glass House Furnace. Receipt lodged with Mrs. Cray and copied to stewardship file. At the bottom, in the same disciplined hand as the planting list, 1 additional line. Cost recorded. Intention noted. Grace sat on the edge of the bed, the paper steady between her fingers while her pulse moved hard at her wrist. She had not asked to be thanked. She had not asked to be known. Yet someone had followed the thread from missing wages to a village broker, to the linen desk, and answered not with praise, but with completion, as if moral arithmetic could be balanced if one person chose to do it precisely. The next afternoon she met Hale by chance on the rose walk, where canes had been cut back to clean angles, and the scent of damp earth held low beneath the cold air. He carried pruning shears and a ledger board under his arm. She carried nothing. Mr. Rigg and Mr. Lyle were returned to work, she said. They were. Efficiently. Efficiency is mercy in estate matters. She searched his face for any sign that he had written the note. His expression remained composed, almost stern, except for a brief softening at the corner of his mouth that never reached performance. You keep careful records for a gardener. I keep records for whatever would otherwise disappear. The answer settled deeper than she wanted it to. She inclined her head. Then I am glad something did not. He looked at her a moment longer than protocol allowed, grey eyes direct and unreadable. Miss Barrett. Mr. Hale. He stepped aside, granting her the path as if it were an acknowledgement, not an instruction. She passed with her chin level and felt his gaze at her back until the curve of yew hedge took her from sight. That evening, Lenora held an engagement supper in the smaller drawing room because she said intimacy impressed families more than spectacle when accounts were tight. The long table gleamed with silver saved from liquidation, crystal polished hard enough to hide hairline cracks, and white candles in tall brass sticks that sent heat upward and left the lower corners of the room cool. Mr. Ashwick was delayed at Redwell by road washout, so his solicitor attended in his place, along with two neighbouring ladies and a magistrate's clerk who had no business at supper, except that paperwork often dined where power gathered. Grace wore the cream silk Lenora preferred and the plainest earrings available. Her hands were bare. She moved through courses with practiced composure, answered questions about hymns and household management in complete sentences, and declined wine twice without explanation. When the fish plates were cleared, Lenora turned to the solicitor with bored civility. "We will review signatures after tea." "Of course, Mrs. Barrett." Grace rose when the butler signalled for service, took the silver tray herself because the nearest footman had been sent to fetch additional spoons, and stepped into the corridor beyond the drawing room to collect the final pot from the sideboard. Voices carried through the partly closed door, Lenora the solicitor, the low response of the clerk. "Once she marries," Lenora said, tone flat as weather, "the trust reverts through my authority. Sentiment is unnecessary." The solicitor spoke more quietly. "Miss Barrett may contest if advised independently." "She will not be advised," Lenora replied. "Her signature has been managed from the beginning." Porcelain shifted on the tray. One cup slid against another and struck the rim with a thin, bright note. Grace tightened her grip. The edge of the saucer bit into her palm where skin had thinned from winter dryness, then broke. Heat from the teapot bled through linen into her hand, while a narrow line of wet spread beneath her fingers, warm at first, then cooling in air. A metallic taste rose at the back of her tongue, as if she had bitten foil. She swallowed once, and found her breath had gone shallow, each inhalation clipped at the top. "Do not drop it." The butler opened the door from within. "Miss Barrett." She entered. Candlelight struck the silver service and flashed against the room's practiced smiles. Lenora glanced up, eyes skimming Grace's face, then lowering to the cups as if quality could be measured in alignment alone. "You are late," Lenora said. "The water required reheating," Grace answered. Her voice did not waver. She served the solicitor first, then the clerk, then the neighbouring ladies. By the time she reached Lenora, blood had tracked along her lifeline and into the heel of her hand, hidden by the fold of napkin beneath the tray. Lenora accepted her cup without thanks. The magistrate's clerk unfolded a document beside his plate. "Mrs. Barrett, shall I witness tonight's addendum or tomorrow at the study?" "Tonight," Lenora said. "Delay invites confusion." Grace set down the sugar tongs in exact parallel and stepped back from the table. "If I may be excused, I will retrieve the chapel reading list." Lenora did not look at her. "Do not be long." In the corridor, Grace walked to the nearest side table before allowing the tray to rest. Her palm throbbed in sharp pulses timed to her heartbeat. She unfolded the napkin and saw a clean crescent cut, not deep, bright against the centre of her hand. She pressed the linen hard until the flow slowed, then refolded it so the stains sat inside the crease and could pass for spilled tea. At the far end of the passage, the study door stood closed. Beneath it, a seam of lamplight cut across carpet like a measured line on a ledger page. Her father's locked writing desk waited within that room under Lenora's key, and somewhere in those drawers were the papers that named what was hers and what had been rewritten, while she copied invitations with obedient ink. The house smelled of beeswax, coal smoke, and black tea, cooling in porcelain. Grace straightened her shoulders, closed her injured hand around the folded napkin, and turned toward the study door. Grace crossed the study threshold and closed the door behind her with her uninjured hand, not to conceal herself, but to hold one room still long enough to think. Lamplight pooled across the leather blotter and the familiar locked desk beneath the window. her father's brass corners bright with handling that was never hers. On the side table lay the addendum the clerk had mentioned, weighted by a paper knife. She read only the first lines before the words blurred into legal scaffolding. Transfer upon marriage, administrative consolidation, acting authority retained by current guardian. Retained, not relinquished. The napkin in her fist had begun to dry against her palm. She set the napkin down, picked up the paper knife, and slid it beneath the ribbon binding the document set. The seal broke with a soft crack. Her heartbeat steadied. She turned pages until she found her name written in a hand not her own, where her consent would be entered after witness. A blank line waited beneath it. From the corridor came the low murmur of voices shifting in the drawing room, chairs moving, silver touched against porcelain. No one had yet come to fetch her. She looked to the locked desk and, for one suspended moment, considered leaving everything exactly as it was, and walking out with nothing but indignation. Indignation would not open a trust. It would not pay wages. It would not survive a magistrate's stamp. She crossed to the fireplace, took up the iron poker, and drove its narrow tip into the desk lock seam once, twice, 3 times with controlled force. The 4th strike split the old brass plate from softened wood. The sound was sharp but not loud enough to carry past heavy doors and supper noise. She set the poker back exactly where it had been and lifted the lid. Inside lay bundles of correspondence tied by year. Bank drafts, 2 ledgers, and a flat red folder she recognized from childhood by the worn edge where her father had thumbed it while explaining settlements she had not yet needed to understand. She opened it on the desk. Barrett Family Trust. Primary beneficiary, Grace Eleanor Barrett. Protective oversight vested temporarily in Renford trusteeship until beneficiary's majority, and marriage by consent. By consent. Her breath deepened for the first time since the corridor. She pulled the page free, folded it once, and slid it inside her bodice. Then she gathered the marriage addendum and the evening contract packet, returned to the side table, and laid them where they would be seen. With her wounded hand, she pressed her palm across the first page until a faint, rust-red crescent marked the lower margin beside her unsigned line. Not dramatic, legible. A knock sounded, brisk and official. "Miss Barrett?" the clerk called through the door. "Mrs. Barrett is ready for execution." Grace opened the door. The clerk stood there with his pen case and polite impatience. She met his eyes and said, "Tell my mother I will join her in 5 minutes." He hesitated, startled by instruction from the wrong direction, then bowed because habit outran thought. "Very good, miss." She went upstairs without hurry. In the blue chamber, she took down the small travelling case from the wardrobe top shelf, laid it on the bed, and packed with the economy of someone counting not garments but exits. 1 wool dress, underlinen, her prayer book with Hale's notes still inside, a comb, 3 sovereigns from her drawer, and the folded receipt from Penrith. She left the cream silk gown over the chair. She left the brocade gloves Lenora preferred. She removed the pearl studs from her ears and placed them in a neat pair on the mantel, then looked once around the room that had flattered captivity and chosen what to abandon. By the time she latched the case, less than 10 minutes had passed. In the corridor outside, Elsie nearly collided with her, carrying fresh candles. The girl's eyes widened at the sight of the bag. "Miss." Grace shifted the handle to her uninjured hand. "If anyone asks, you did not see me until I was already downstairs." Elsie swallowed. "Yes, miss." Grace paused, then added, "There is seed cake in the pantry drawer behind the flour tin. Take it before Mr. Pritchard counts stores." A startled, fleeting smile touched the maid's mouth. "I will, miss." Grace went down the main stair this time, not the service one. At the drawing-room door, the butler moved as if to announce her. She stepped past him before he could speak and continued to the study. Voices followed, then silence, then the soft rustle of people rising. Lenora entered first, composed, the solicitor and clerk behind her. Two neighbouring ladies stalled in the corridor by curiosity they pretended was concern. "Grace?" Lenora said, seeing the travelling case, and then the open desk. "What is the meaning of this display?" Grace set the case beside the study chair and placed the contract packet on Lenora's ledger, exactly centered. "The meaning is plain. You had no permission to enter this room alone." "I required no permission." Lenora's gaze moved to the broken lock plate, to the red mark on the contract margin, and sharpened by a degree that would have passed unnoticed to anyone but her daughter. "You will return those papers." Grace drew the trust page from her bodice and handed it, not to Lenora, but to the clerk. "Read line 7 aloud." The clerk blinked, looked to Lenora for instruction, received none quickly enough, and read with legal caution. Protective oversight vested temporarily in Renford trusteeship until beneficiaries' majority and marriage by consent. The words settled in the room like a dropped weight. He extended the page back. Grace took it and tucked it securely into her bodice again. Lenora recovered first. Consent was given when she signed the family agreement. Grace opened her injured hand and laid the blood-marked napkin beside the contract. "Then record this as withdrawal." "Do not be theatrical." "Then be accurate." The solicitor cleared his throat. "Mrs. Barrett, if Miss Barrett contests execution under coercion, I must advise postponement pending independent review." Lenora said his title as if it were an insult. "You are retained by this household." "I am retained by enforceable law." Grace lifted the contract and with measured care wrote across the signature line in a firm hand. "I do not consent." She blotted it with clean paper, then set the sheet down before Lenora. Lenora's voice dropped, flatter than anger. "If you leave this house tonight, you leave with no allowance, no social protection, and no expectation of return." Grace met her mother's eyes and felt her own pulse, steady now. "I leave with my name." One of the corridor ladies inhaled sharply. The clerk stared at his pen case as if etiquette could rescue him. The solicitor did not speak at all. Lenora looked at the bag again. "Where do you imagine you will go?" "To the truth first," Grace said. "The rest can follow." She turned, lifted the case, and walked out before reply could become command. In the drawing room, candles had burned lower, wax running down brass stems in pale ridges. The fire had settled to a red centre and quiet blue tongues along one log. She crossed to the coat stand near the mantel, fingers stiff around the handle. Her blood had dried in a thin, dark line across her palm. She set the case down, reached for her wool cloak, and then saw that the portrait above the mantel had been uncovered. It had hung veiled for weeks under muslin, while the room was being refreshed, or so Mrs. Fell had said. Now the cloth was gone. In its place stood a man in formal dress and ducal coronet, painted with unsentimental precision. Iron-grey eyes, the old pale line across one brow, shoulders held in that same economical authority she had watched redirect deliveries, wages, and men. Not a resemblance. The same man. Footsteps sounded behind her, unhurried. She did not turn at once. She looked at the painted gaze that had watched this room long before she arrived. Then, at the reflection in the mantel mirror, where a dark-coated figure entered the doorway, with mud no longer on his cuffs. When she turned, he stood at a respectful distance, hands bare, expression composed in the way she had come to recognize as restraint under pressure. No gardener's gloves. No pretense left. "My name is Julian Harrow, Duke of Renford," he said quietly. "This house and your trust have been under my legal protection since your father's death." The corridor noise thinned to nothing. Grace felt, with almost physical force, the past weeks reorder themselves. The invoice corrected from memory, the steward obeying a glance, the chapel decisions made without notebook, the phrase about rooms opening from the inside spoken by a man who had held keys all along and had chosen not to use them against her. She set her case upright beside her skirts. "You let me believe you were hired labor. I let you see what you would do when rank offered you no advantage." His voice remained low, even. "You gave water. You returned wages. You refused a transfer written as a marriage. I needed no further proof." Behind him, Lenora's steps sounded at the threshold, then stopped as she took in the portrait, the stance, the impossible arithmetic now made plain. For the first time Grace had known her, silence found her mother first. Julian did not look away from Grace. "If you wish to leave tonight, a carriage will be prepared within the quarter hour. If you wish to remain, no paper in this house will move without your review. The choice is yours." Choice, spoken without theatre, without demand. Grace drew on her cloak slowly, fastening it with her good hand while her injured one trembled once and stilled. She looked up at the portrait, then at the man beneath it, and understood that the door she had forced open in the study had not been the only one. "I will not sign anything tonight," she said. A brief change came over his face, almost a smile transforming severity into something warmer and unexpectedly young. "Nor will anyone else." He stepped aside, granting her the center of the room she had crossed as catalogued property an hour earlier. She stood beneath the mantel, between the unveiled portrait and the living Duke, with her travel case at her feet and her trust paper against her heart, and did not move until she was ready. She did not move until she was ready, then lifted her chin and looked past Julian to the doorway, where Lenora still stood with one hand on the frame, as if wood could be made into jurisdiction by touch alone. "The solicitor and the clerk are already in the house," Grace said. "I would like this settled while every witness is still awake." Julian inclined his head once. "It will be." Lenora found her voice in a clipped, even register. "You are entertaining hysteria, Your Grace. My daughter has had an emotional evening." Grace turned to her mother, palms still banded in the folded linen that had gone stiff with dried blood. "Then let us rely on documents rather than mood." Julian did not raise his voice. "Mrs. Barrett, return to the study." The command was quiet. It did not invite argument. Lenora's expression shifted not to contrition, but to calculation, and she turned without curtsy or acknowledgement. The two neighbouring ladies stranded in the corridor lowered their eyes with sudden interest in carpet weave. Neither offered sympathy, neither offered contempt. Society, Grace thought, had already scented weather changing. In the study, the fire had burned low, and the broken brass lock plate lay on the desk blotter beside the addendum. The clerk stood near the side table with pen case open, uncertain where to look. The solicitor held his hat with both hands and seemed older than he had at supper, his confidence reduced to legal caution. Julian entered last and closed the door. "Read Miss Barrett's trust clause again," he said. The clerk obeyed, voice steadier on the second recitation. "Protective oversight vested temporarily in Renford trusteeship until beneficiary's majority and marriage by consent." And read her notation on tonight's contract. The clerk lifted the marked page. "I do not consent." Lenora gave a short, controlled exhale. "A private annotation does not invalidate established management." The solicitor answered before Julian could speak. "It compels suspension pending independent review, Mrs. Barrett." Given the beneficiary's written refusal and visible injury at execution, I cannot certify voluntary assent. Julian rested 2 fingers on the edge of the desk. Gaze on Lenora. You will surrender every key connected to trust papers, household payroll, and outgoing correspondence. This is my household. This is my estate, he said, and she is not your account. Silence held for a full breath. Then Lenora reached into her reticule and removed a ring of keys, selecting 3 with precise irritation before setting them on the blotter. 1 small brass key remained in her glove. Grace recognized it at once. The dispatch box key, taken from her at dawn weeks ago. Lenora's hand paused a fraction, then placed that key down as well. The solicitor cleared his throat. Your Grace, for enforceability, we should draft immediate interim instructions and send them under seal to the magistrate tonight. Mr. Ellery can write at once. Julian looked to Grace, not to the men. Do you want that done now? Yes. Then it is done. He turned to the clerk. Right. The next 20 minutes passed in the scrape of nibs and the dry whisper of pages turned. By midnight, the clerk had drafted a temporary injunction suspending Lenora's financial authority, preserving all trust assets and requiring independent audit at first light. The solicitor sanded each page, shook off the excess, and passed them one by one. Grace read every line before signing. Her hand trembled once on the second signature and stilled by the third. When the final seal was pressed, Julian called for the night courier. A groom arrived, boots damp from the yard, and took the packet tucked in oilskin. He looked at Julian and then at Grace, surprised to find her standing at the desk head where only Lenora had stood before. Ride directly, Julian said, to the magistrate's chambers. Wait for receipt. Yes, Your Grace. The door shut behind him. Lenora had not sat down once. She stood by the bookcase in her dark satin, posture immaculate, eyes bright with fury she refused to perform. What do you intend, she asked Grace, when novelty fades and consequence remains? Grace folded her copy of the injunction and placed it inside her prayer book with the planting notes and Penrith receipt. To live without being administered. She picked up her travelling case. Julian moved to speak. She shook her head slightly. I asked for no signatures tonight, she said. I asked for one room with a lock that answers me. You will have it, he said. The blue chamber no longer suited. She chose the old schoolroom at the West End instead, a room overlooking the kitchen gardens and village road, with plain oak furniture and a narrow desk scarred by generations of arithmetic. Elsie brought fresh water without being told. This time the bell pull worked when Grace tested it. Someone had repaired the line during the night. The small, practical click of it answering felt like proof that systems could change faster than grief. 3 days passed before the magistrate's reply returned. On the third morning, grey light lay across the west corridor when the butler knocked and handed Grace a sealed packet with county wax. She took it to the drawing room where the portrait still watched from above the mantel, and the muslin veil lay folded on a chair, retired like an old lie. Julian arrived as she broke the seal. His coat was dark wool, his hands ungloved, his expression composed in that familiar way that concealed fatigue, but not attention. Read it aloud, he said. She unfolded the order. By review of submitted instruments, witness statement, and preliminary ledgers, financial guardianship previously exercised by Mrs. Lenora Barrett is terminated with immediate effect. Interim authority is vested in Grace Eleanor Barrett as primary beneficiary, with ducal trusteeship retained solely as protective oversight subject to her written direction. She read the line again, slower. Primary beneficiary, written direction. A knock sounded. The butler admitted Lenora, dressed for departure in travelling black, gloves buttoned, jaw set. Behind her stood Dunley with 2 boxes of account books and 1 leather valise. His eyes met Grace's briefly, then dropped. "The carriage is prepared, madam," the butler said to Lenora. Lenora looked first at Julian, then at Grace. "You have achieved spectacle." Grace set the magistrate's order on the mantel shelf beneath the portrait. "No, accuracy." Lenora's mouth tightened by a degree. "You confuse autonomy with wisdom. Then permit me the education." For the first time, Lenora did not answer. She turned to leave. At the door she paused as if a final line had been prepared and found suddenly unprofitable. Then walked out. Dunley followed with the boxes. He stopped once in the corridor, looked back at Grace with the same loaded uncertainty he had carried for weeks, and spoke without stepping inside. "I copied Mrs. Barrett's diversion entries," he said, voice low, "to protect myself. They are in the top box, tied in blue tape. I should have reported sooner." Grace held his gaze. "You are reporting now." He gave one short nod and went after Lenora. By the second week of November, the audit had been completed in the study where Grace once copied invitations under watch. The diverted funds were traced, the unpaid wages restored, the inflated invoices corrected, and every sealed packet catalogued under her own key. She kept the blood-marked contract page in a separate file, labelled Withdrawn Instruments, not as a wound, but as precedent. That afternoon she stood in the drawing room with ledger books, school maps, and a draft proposal spread across the low table. Outside, children's voices carried faintly from the village lane. Inside, firelight moved along marble and gilt. Julian placed a smaller folder beside hers. "These are the parish numbers you requested. Current attendance, winter absences, and repair estimates for the old school roof. You had them ready. You asked yesterday." She scanned the figures, then tapped one line. "If we move lantern funds and half the spring ballroom allocation, we can hire a second teacher and keep the furnace through February." He watched her profile as she calculated, not interrupting. "Approve it." She looked up. "You have not reviewed the full plan." "I reviewed you." The words might have sounded like flattery from another mouth. From his, they sounded like record. She set down the pen and reached into her reticule, drawing out 2 things: the Penrith receipt and the tiny key Lenora had surrendered on the blotter. She placed both between them. "The brooch is gone," she said. "I would choose that again." His gaze moved over the receipt, then back to her. "I know. I also left pearl studs on the blue chamber mantel the night I walked out." He opened the folder and removed a small envelope. Inside lay the studs wrapped in plain tissue. "Elsie brought them to my steward at dawn. She said they looked like a closed account." Grace almost smiled. "Wise girl." He hesitated, then reached into his coat pocket and set down 3 folded scraps in the same disciplined hand. She knew by now, before seeing ink. The hinge seized from the inside. "South windows hold heat longest. Cost recorded. Intention noted." "You wrote them," she said. "Yes." "Why no signature?" "I did not want gratitude to become obligation." She considered that, then placed her hand flat on the school proposal. "This is not gratitude." "No," he said. "It is governance." He shifted 1 page toward her, and his fingers came to rest on the same margin where hers already lay. Neither moved away. The contact was brief, unforced, and steadier than any declaration could have been. At dusk, the first meeting of the new estate school committee assembled in the very drawing room where she had once carried tea as an accessory to her own transfer. Mrs. Cray came with supply tallies. The rector's wife came with attendance lists and no lace opinions this time. Riggs stood awkwardly near the door, holding cap and chalk inventory. Lyle arrived late, smelling faintly of furnace soot, and apologized to Grace directly. She asked him to sit. When discussion turned to budget, one parish lady began, "If Miss Barrett would prefer to observe rather than decide," Grace answered before Julian could. "I will decide." No one challenged her again. After the meeting, when the room emptied and the fire settled to coals, she remained by the mantel beneath Julian's portrait, now no longer a puzzle above her, but a history beside her. Julian closed the ledger, set it aside, and stood at her shoulder, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cooling room. "You may still leave Renford," he said, "at any hour, with full settlement and no condition." She looked at the school plans spread in her hand, at the signatures already entered under her direction, at the key ring now resting in her own palm with weight that felt earned rather than imposed. "I know," she said. Then, after a quiet breath, "I am staying." He nodded once, relief passing through his face like light across stone. Not dramatic, certain. She moved the final approved page onto the mantel table, and he set his hand over the corner to keep it flat while the sealing wax cooled. Their hands remained there together, resting on the same document, while the house that had once catalogued her learned the shape of her authority.